Do we have any apologies for absence?
We have received apologies today from Councillor Peter Jones, Councillor Andrew Stevens and Councillor Rob Stewart.
Okay, thank you very much. Any disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests? No? Okay, prohibition of whip votes and declaration of party whips, which goes without saying. And the next item is the minutes of the previous meeting. I shall go through them page by page. Page 1, page 2, the budget monitoring report. Page 3, which continues, then the peer review and self-assessment. Page 4, a work plan. Okay, minutes as a whole. Any issues with the minutes? Anyone?
If not, I'll move them, Chairman.
Pardon?
If not, I'll move them.
Okay, thank you. Right, then, Emily, do we have any public questions?
No public questions, no.
Thank you. Then we come on to the Q1 performance monitoring report. Richard, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you. I should probably start off by pointing the panel to the second paragraph of the report on page 6, which sets out the broader context for this particular report and highlights the ongoing impact of the pandemic and specifically its effect on performance during this period. But if I can draw the panel's attention firstly to the data tables. So they start on page 20 of your report. Or page 1, there's 2 numbers. I'll be referring to the page number on the far left of the report. So the graph on the first page there shows that overall 81% of the indicators either improved or they stayed the same compared to Q1 last year, albeit on reporting a reduced number of indicators. So we had 55 indicators reported in Q1 last year, compared to 21 comparable indicators this quarter. So it's going to be a much shorter report than usual, so we should be able to move through the report quite quickly. There are a number of reasons for that, some related to the pandemic and other reasons too. So for example, if we turn to the safeguarding priority on the next page, you can see that we've got no safeguarding indicators to report in this first quarter, and that's for 2 main reasons. Firstly, because of the implementation by social services of the Welsh Community Care Information System, or WCCIS. And secondly, as a result of the Welsh Government updating the social services performance framework, and then the work required through WCCIS to establish those indicators locally. And those reasons are set out within the narrative provided by the Director of Social Services on page 21 or page 2. This has now been worked through, and I'm pleased to inform the panel that social services data will be available and included in the Q2 report. In the meantime, the Director's overview sets out the arrangements to ensure that individuals have remained safeguarded, and that has continued, and that they've put in place interim arrangements to make sure that operational performance continue to be robustly monitored. The Director's overview also points out that the impact from COVID and demand across both child and family and adult services remains high, particularly in adult social care, and that's detailed in the rest of the narrative on page 21. And I'll pause there in case there are any questions.
Okay, has anyone got any questions at all in that?
Yeah, can I just ask?
So,
It's Jeff Jones. Sorry. Jeff Jones. Sorry, I had my camera on.
up, Jeff, please.
Sorry, my apologies. Yeah, it's good news in the first instance, you know, that I think you said 80% of the indicators have improved and so on. But, you know, COVID has definitely skewed the outlook. These indicators, how were they selected? I think I remember, I haven't got the report in front of me after reading it. It was done by the Welsh Government. And, you know, if they've improved, is it because we actually perhaps put the resource into those particular areas?
Yeah, it's the indicators in this report, the primary purpose of them is to measure progress against the corporate plan. So the priorities which are set out within the corporate plan itself. So the indicators that we put within this report are selected for that purpose. The matter here is a broader one. Welsh Government have introduced a new performance framework for social services. So they've changed the indicators. So we've been working with social services to select a number of indicators from that new suite provided by the Welsh Government for inclusion within the report. The issue has been that it's the timing really. When Welsh Government introduced these indicators, we've had to work with social services to ensure that we all understand how they're going to be collected locally and that they're defined properly. And then the added complication of making sure that that's been, put through the new WCCIS system as well. But that work has now been completed, so we'll be reporting these indicators in the second quarter.
Paxton?
Thank you, Chairman. You touched on something then, Richard, which we have talked about in other scrutiny meetings, I think. But obviously, or not obviously, but as I understand it, Welsh Government is beginning to demand even more information for us in terms of performance monitoring. And I know we've raised concerns in terms of the extra bureaucracy that's going to impose on the council. Any comments on that at this stage, or anything you want to say to it?
We're still working our way through that. I think the last presentation that we did to the panel around the Local Government and Elections Act, we're starting to put that into effect now. So we've tried to build those arrangements into our quarterly performance monitoring going forward, and also into the work that we do to produce our annual wellbeing report and the annual governance statement. So that work has commenced with the second quarter and in October. So it'll probably become clear what the effect of that is going to be going forward. What we have done though is to take an approach where we're trying to build these new arrangements in the existing processes, so that we're not creating something new, additional and separate from everything else. Which wouldn't make sense from an integration perspective, but also it would probably create too much of an extra burden on the people that we work with. So we're trying to balance all of these requirements with that, and trying to make it so that we're able to meet the requirements, but at the same time not overburden everybody with all these extra reporting requirements.
Okay, we watched that with interest then, Richard, I think.
Yeah.
And if you think it is getting onerous and you think we can do anything as scrutiny panels to talk to Welsh Government, then please let us know.
Okay, thanks, Councillor.
Okay, anyone else? No, okay, can we move on, Richard?
Okay, yeah, so moving on to education and skills, that's on page 22 or page 3. Likewise in education, there are fewer indicators being reported this quarter. The authority-wide attainment measures at foundation phase, key stage 2 and key stage 3, they aren't being collected by the Welsh Government anymore. And the published attendance data is still not available as a result of the pandemic. Although the overview on page 22 provided by the Director of Education does describe how attendance is generally lower across Wales because of COVID-19, especially in deprived areas. Again, I'll pause in case there are any questions.
Any questions? I think we all accept that there was always going to be a less attendance with the way in which COVID is turning out. Okay, and can we move on then, Richard?
Okay, in terms of the economy and infrastructure, there's nothing significant to note within the performance data, which is on pages 30 to 33 or 11 to 14. But the overview on pages 27 and 29 or 8 to 10, that does set out a detailed description of the progress that's been made to regenerate in the city, despite the challenges with the rising cost of materials and the effect that that's obviously having, plus the work that's been undertaken to support economic recovery following the pandemic, and the work to improve housing and some of the delays there to the work around the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, again because of the pandemic, and the work ongoing now to pick that up, and the work to meet decarbonisation targets as well.
Okay, any questions or comments on this? No? I think there is a couple of questions on this, Richard, and mostly concerning the percentage of major applications to economic on page 12, where we see the red rag signs. I noticed these figures form part of a yearly target, so we assuming that quarter 2 will be better than quarter 1.
Yes, that's right, Councillor. In the improving economy and infrastructure priority there, we've got a number of indicators which are static, but that's largely either because the target or the result is 100%. So that's as good as you're going to get it. Or in a couple of the cases around the targeted regeneration investment indicators, the schemes haven't progressed because, as you say, it's a matter of timing really. So that information will be available then in the second quarter.
Okay, and the only other one then, which is I suppose of concern, is EPS 2814, and that's the planning applications. But in the narrative that comes with it, it does say there's received a 50% increase on last year's planning application. So I suspect that has part to do with that declining figure.
Yes, the result itself, it's obviously better than the first quarter last year. It's slightly down on the result of the first quarter in 2019-20, but it is above target. But as you quite rightly say, there has been an increase in the number of applications, and that inevitably has an impact on the performance as well.
Okay. Anyone else? Any comments? No. Can we then move on to tackling poverty?
Okay, so tackling poverty, which starts on page 36 or 17. So we have the narrative on page 34 and 35, or pages 15 and 16, and that provides the background and the context around the impact of the pandemic on the work to tackle poverty. The majority of the data itself, which is on pages 37 to 40 or 18 to 21, that's actually showing improving trends, with the exception of the two indicators on page 39 or page 20, and explanations for both of those are included within the report.
And 21. Because quarter one doesn't look, when you consider that, but they are improving slightly.
Yeah.
Anyone, any comments on this? I have to say this one wasn't the best of reading, but then again, you've got to accept the fact that the benefit system is changing again. It's probably going to work through that, and we have to wait to see what the effects that has on the whole performance. Peter Black.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I was just looking at this pie chart on page 30. I don't know what it is. 36. It says on the side.
Or 17.
Whatever. Yeah. Performance compared to the same period. It's a quarter declining, 3 quarters improving. I'm not quite sure what it's showing.
It's shown that compared to the first quarter of last year, the indicators included within the report are showing improving performance. 6 of them are, and 2 are showing declining performance compared to the first quarter of last year.
What are those indicators? So I'm struggling with this.
Sorry, it's the indicators that then follow. So that pie chart represents.
So the one next page.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
It's not just the next page, Peter. It's pages 18, 19, and 20 through to 21. Is it not, Richard?
That's right. That's right.
Right. So this is basically to do with process indicators, really. How fast we're processing housing benefit, how fast we're processing tax reduction applications, that sort of thing.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, but in terms of actually tackling poverty, we're not really making much of an impact.
I think that we are. I think what the report is highlighting is that the indicators, as you quite rightly say, the process indicators within the report are showing an improvement compared to the previous quarter one. The narrative really sort of sets out the broader context, and that's obviously the work there to tackle poverty has been, quite significantly impacted by the pandemic.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, because on the last set of those indicators, they're virtually all red. Quarter one, they're all red. A couple of greens on quarter. So that's a number of people gaining employment, number of accredited qualifications. That they're mostly red, aren't they?
They were red in previous quarters. So if we read across, we can see that if you're looking at POV 10 and POV 11 on page 40, you can see that in the first quarter of 2019-20 they were red. The quarter of 2020-21, there was less data there because we were entering the pandemic then, but we can see that the overall trend was improving, and that's continued into this quarter one as well.
Yeah. I mean, my point really is that when we say we're tackling poverty, what we're actually doing is alleviating poverty. In the sense, you know, that we're not actually having a huge impact on making people less poor, but we're helping them get through it.
Well, I think that is the whole essence of what we are.
I just always feel this phrase "tackling poverty" is misleading in that respect. That's the point I'm making. But
Okay.
yeah, I'm just, you know, okay. So I think Adam wants to contradict me.
No, I don't think he wants to contradict you. I think he's trying to say that
He normally
this is
does.
the way the council will tackle poverty. Adam.
Thanks. Yeah, no, for once, Peter, I sort of do agree with you that the tackling poverty, this is a suite of indicators as defined, as already mentioned, in terms of Welsh Government, what we need to report. This doesn't give us the whole suite of what we're doing to tackle poverty. You're right in terms of making people less poor is one aspect of it. Tackling poverty covers a lot of other areas. You know, if you think about what we're doing in terms of housing, what you're doing in terms of homelessness, what we're doing in terms of job creation, what we're doing in terms of improvement of place. So all those will help. What we do with the business improvement district, how we work with the colleges and the universities to get training through. We're doing a lot to tackle poverty. The problem is it's such a massive area. It's a generational change that we're looking at. We're not going to do it within 1 or 2 years. So it is difficult. The terminology is the terminology we've got, and we can't really change that. And perhaps one of the things that we need to do come the new administration next May is maybe look at some of the terms that we use and perhaps define these a little bit better. But I think it's important you read the narrative. And just I think there was a bit of confusion about what's red and green. So on the actual, if we take sort of page 37 or 18, both are numbered on there, depending if it's the pack or this slide deck. Across the top, of course, is 1920, 2021, and then 21-22 being the current year. So 21-22, that third column, is the one that we need to focus on for this year in terms of colouring, of which the majority are positive in terms of helping towards tackling poverty as opposed to actually tackling it in its entirety. So generally, we're doing a lot as a council with the Poverty Truth Commission, what we're doing with our Poverty Forum, how we're doing in terms of revs and bends, but it's with a ever-changing landscape, as Councillor Holly already mentioned. You know, if the benefits change, we see a whole new raft of people, and obviously with COVID, that's affected it also. So lots of change, probably something we can do moving forward in terms of how we describe it around that tackling poverty.
To be fair, I have made the same point to the Welsh Government when I was an Assembly member, so I'm not just making this now.
Okay. Councillor Des Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Adam has said more or less. He's covered it, hasn't he? But it's semantics, isn't it, Peter? I mean, if we put more money in people's pockets by helping them through the welfare system, then as far as they're concerned, you know, you're easing their poverty. But the whole raft of the other things go along with it.
Yeah. Okay, guys.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think. Yeah, the terminology is one that the Welsh Government uses and the one that we've got to actually use as well. So we are trapped in that. I think the real issue is we're tackling poverty by increasing the availability of and giving the knowledge to people to be able to get into that, either into training or into get benefits that they're entitled to. I think that's the benefit of all this. I think the other thing why it's important that we have the previous couple of years, Adam, is that we need to notice what the trends are. But the problem is with the benefit system changing so often, the trends tend to lose. Well, if you to want of a better term, they become pointless in many respects, because if you change, as we are with the universal credit now, we cut in £20 on it, that will change the dynamic of the benefit system, and as a result of that, then we are looking for trends to see improvements. But because if you like, the yardstick is changing, the trends tend not to give you a true aspect of what's happening. So I think that's one of the problems we have, especially within the tackling poverty schemes. Okay, Des, did you want to come back? No. Okay. Adam?
Yeah, absolutely agree with you, Chris. And I think that's why we use the comments on the side to try and give that narrative around what's changed in real terms, rather than that trend analysis. And I sometimes wonder whether sometimes the comments, because it's only a small area, we can't always get everything in there that we want to probably tell that story, as you mentioned, about how things are changing, and the trend doesn't perhaps look good, but actually what the work that we're doing to combat it is probably much more. So that may be something that, again, we could have a look at in how we use that first front page of the narrative to get more actual improvements in to show what we're doing.
I think the only thing, that the narrative on the first 2 pages does give quite a bit of support to what is being said. I think, as I say, I come back to what I said earlier on. It's because the way in which the benefit system changes so often that, we want to see a trend and we want to see if it's improving, but it's a bit difficult. Jeff, you've got your hand up. Jeff Jones, Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yeah, going back perhaps to basics, I don't know if you actually got this. We're talking about tackling poverty, but what is actually classed as poverty? Where are we actually starting from? How do you actually classify an individual or a family that are actually in poverty? So how is the measurement taken? Is it, from a certain base? Have we got that base information?
We have got it. Whether or not, I don't think Richard's got it now, and I'm not sure if Adam can give you that, but it's normally based around the Roundtree Foundation definition, is it not, Adam?
Yeah, there's a couple of definitions really that we all amalgamate together. So there's the Welsh indices of multiple deprivation, there's the Roundtree Foundation in terms of what they class as poverty. It's also many different metrics, and we try and amalgamate all of them, working on Welsh Government. We could probably do a better written response of what comes into that, Jeff, if we can, so that we can just break it down in a little more middle. It's a bit complex in terms of how it all comes together. It's things like the wellbeing assessment has a feed into that. So there's lots of bits, and we try and consolidate all of it to for us what that means.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, because you need to start from somewhere to actually measure something.
Generally speaking, the Roundtree Foundation is the one that probably is the more acceptable one right across the UK. So, okay, right. Can we go on to transforming future council?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we're moving on to the penultimate section now. Perhaps if I take the last 2 sections together. The future council priority starts on page 41 or 22. There's only one indicator in this section, which is on page 44 or 25, which is showing a drop in performance compared to the same period last year, which is explained within the comment that's been provided. And finally, we only have one indicator within the last section, which is the recycling indicator on page 47 or 27, which is showing improvement compared to the same period last year.
I'm sorry, Peter. Councillor Peter Jones, Peter Black, Jeff, and you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question in this?
It's better than being confused for Peter May, I suppose. Just
not much.
I was looking at the first 2 indicators in terms of, well, particularly the number of online payments received via City and County of Swansea websites. and the next one I think is the number of forms completed online. Now, I accept there's a slight improvement in the first one, but the trend is fairly, it's not a huge upward rise, is it? And there's a decline in the second one. I'm not blaming you, I'm just a bit surprised, because given the pandemic, we're all working from home, everybody's working online. I would have expected a much higher uptake on online transactions with the council. It just seems to me to seem quite right. Or is the indicator not really indicating that?
Which one are you on about, Peter? Are you on about
there's both of them.
CHRO?
No, the Transformation and Future Council, number of online payments received via City and County of Swansea websites, and number of forms completed online for fully automated processes.
Yeah. Okay. Richard, have you got anything to say about that other than what's in the narrative?
No, it's the Councillor Black's quite right. The first indicator there is showing that there has been an increase in terms of the online payments received through the website. The second indicator is slightly misleading. You can see that the figure there has dropped. It's largely because there was a large uptake in the first quarter of last year because of the pandemic and the particular circumstances, increasing online demand with particular regard to the area of waste collection, high volume waste collection and pickup requests.
Right.
So the figure this year, although it's dropped, it's still high relative to the past. It's just that there was an aberration in the first quarter of last year, and now it's sort of correcting itself.
Yeah, it's just that I was expecting it to be maintained, given we're not really fully operational back in the offices, and people. I mean, it's nothing anyone to blame. It just seemed to me to be a bit surprising that we haven't maintained that increase, given where we are in terms of the pandemic and where we are in terms of remote working as a council and moving, even actually making that permanent. I think in many respects, that's just the point I was making, really.
Okay. Phil Downing, Councillor Phil Downing.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Only to say, I'm sorry I'm late to the meeting, but we had a bit of an emergency this morning. Some kind person has removed the lead from our community building and the water's pouring in. I don't know what I could do about it, mine, but they called me out. So that's the reason I'm late.
I'm sure, Phil, that you could have solved the problem given a bit more time. Okay. Any other questions on the Transformation and Future Council? No. I think the one that's really significant for me is PRO CL12, Richard. No, all results are 0.
Yeah.
I am really quite pleased about that. So that one I think we should be celebrating, really. Now, nature and biodiversity. Any comments on that? No. Okay, right on. Well, thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you,
As
Chair.
you said, it was a much shorter one today than normally, and I do appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Right, then we move on to the one that always causes a few problems, and that's the overview understanding financial item 7, which is the Chief Finance Officer, Ben. He's been invited, is he here? Yes, he is.
Thank you, Chair. I am here, and hopefully the power of technology is just about to upload some slides to accompany it. I'm hoping you can start to see something on screen.
Yeah.
This will be by way of aid memoir to assist me talking to you on it, and not an official presentation. So by way of background, what are they for? Well, as I indicated at council, there are 2 different types of reserves. There's usable and unusable. The usable ones, what are they for? They're jolly useful for managing cash flow, and I've needed quite a lot of that in the last 18 months because most of them are cash backed. That means I'm sitting on cash on the balance sheet. They're very useful for contingency, to respond to black swan moments, and we're still in the midst of one of those. So again, it was jolly useful to have some reserves set aside. The earmarked ones are very much like savings accounts at home, savings for specific purposes. Using the example just before, one could be the lead roof replacement reserve, you know, in terms of pots for rainy days. They're also useful for smoothing out costs over years when things are lumpy and bumpy. We have local elections once every 5 years, so rather than charge it once every 5 years, save a bit of money each year, pop it in a reserve, spend it when it's election time locally. And they're also jolly useful for signalling advanced spending plans, probably especially so given the relative generosity of Welsh Government with its COVID money right at the end of last year, which saw reserves swell, but also a number of commitments made to support specific spending, to support ICT reserves and to spend on the recovery fund. And then you've got those unusable ones, which I normally skirt over, and I will spend a very brief amount of time on them first today, just so that you get a bit of more of a primer on them. And they're unashamedly a local government accounting conceit, a simple device to make the accounts work. So other than giving you a little flavour of what they are, it's the reason why I then say you can't do anything with them because they're not real, as you've heard us say in council. So as I say, starting with the funny non-money reserves, they're non-cash, there's no cash behind them at all, so they're useless for practical purposes. I wanted to give you a brief partial explanation because, as you're aware, it was a bit of a major issue with our auditors, and it's £1 billion worth of reserves on some of these items. The two really technical ones, the Reval Reserve and the fixed and the capital adjustment reserve, you've got £1 billion in. And then you have a rather large minus pension fund reserve. So they're big sums, and it would be remiss of me not to give you a brief explanation of what they're for. And I'm not joking, even accountants lose the will to actually work out what's going on in these entries. They are seen as a bit of a twilight zone. As I made clear at council, you get the estimate wrong by 1%, over 10 million quid, you're straight over the materiality threshold that the auditors apply. And it don't matter whether it's £10 million worth of cash or £10 million worth of funny money, they will comment accordingly. So it is important, even if they're not real. I'm not going to attempt to explain what's going on in all of these reserves, but I'm going to focus on three of them and just give you a flavour of what they do. The Revaluation Reserve books unrealised theoretical gains on fixed assets. If your fixed assets were worth £1 billion 10 years ago and they're worth £2 billion today in valuation terms, you've got an extra £1 billion on the fixed asset side of the balance sheet on the debit side. You need some way of equalising out the seesaw, so you need to book £1 billion to the other side of the equation. And that's effectively why you have the Revaluation Reserve. There's 101 other entries that go in each year because things are indexed up, indexed down, disposed of in due course. And these are all theoretical worths. Nothing's worth anything until you can get what you can get for when you try to sell it. But it's why it has very large sums, because we have a couple of billions. We do have a couple of £1 billion worth of assets on our balance sheet, and that's why we have a very large Revaluation Reserve. The Capital Adjustment Reserve is even more bizarre, but bear with me, it is unique to local government. Proper accounting practice requires all companies' assets as they and also prudently setting aside for future replacement. But we can't do that in local government because we're constrained by legislation, and that requires us to make the minimum revenue provision, which is. Sorry, Chris, I've tried to continue. It's probably a whine, but I switch off the screen, but that isn't going to work. So, can you hear me still now? I will continue. And then let me know if I'm
people are missing out some of what you're saying. So,
yeah, I can hear.
I'll continue then, and we'll mop up at the end, and I'll switch the screen off at the end. Some of you can hear. So legislation requires a minimum revenue provision for debt. The two simply don't match over time. So the difference gets booked there. And the thing you're looking out for is whether that goes negative. If it's negative, it gives you a clue that we're using up assets faster than I'm paying for them. You're more likely to see them being positive, and that's the position we're in. The biggie is the pensions reserve, and as you'll be aware, again, local government pensions are different compared to most of the public sector. The LGPS guarantees those pension payments, and it's a funded scheme, unlike most other public sector schemes. But of course, those liabilities and guarantees are now, and the obligations are funded over the lifetime of the pension fund members, so up to about 20 years, and part of it's met from taxes in future decades. So you should expect to see a very large negative figure on the balance sheet, and indeed you do. Just a quick canter through what they are, because they're quite boring, but they're very large value. Getting on to the more interesting part, the real cash-backed reserves. The main ones in terms of the general fund, housing revenue account and schools. They're all separate. Strict ring fence between general fund and the housing revenue account. No such strict fence with schools reserves. Whilst they're for schools and held by schools, technically I can borrow and lend from them between schools and between the general fund, but I don't think I'd be popular with head teachers if I did, so I don't. Earmarked reserves can be used for any known purpose. You can have as few or as many as you or I like, and they are, as much as anything, designed to signal their intent for future use. And as you will be aware, some of them have been held on balance sheet for decades and will continue to be so, especially things like the profit share on Welsh Development Agency and Joint Development Agency arrangements, and some of them have spend plans which mean they're very short term, such as the Recovery Fund. Is it art or science? Well, the answer is it's a bit of both. The one thing that's unavoidable is you must have some reserves, or I will have failed completely in my legal duty. Remember, a lot of these are cash backed, and that's what gives you the buffer to have got through the last 18 months. You do, as a council, have a choice between earmarked and general reserves, and again, there's no right level by value or volume or percentage as to what you should do. But broadly, the higher the risks the authority faces, the higher the reserve should be. Generally, the bigger the authority, the lower can be reserves as a whole. Those of you that sit on community councils and smaller bodies will probably see proportionately higher general reserves held in those bodies. They're less likely to be able to survive a black swan moment if they've got an annual revenue requirement of £3,000 rather than £500 million. And the other general yardstick is if you've got lots of high value earmarked reserves, you can probably get away with lower general reserves. And that's pretty much where we are. You've seen substantial increases in earmarked reserves, 17 million 2 years ago, another £55 million in this last to top up general reserves ever so slightly. For a £500 million spending organisation net, 10 million of general reserves is not that much, but I'm relatively relaxed, as I indicated to council, because of the high value of earmarked reserves. So to some extent it comes to posit the question, well, can we have a reserve for anything? And pretty much yes. You could have a reserve for a rainy day reserve. You could call a reserve anything under the sun. And yes, you can, as long as it's a plausible risk. And if you can afford it. The ones that are cash backed require you to have enough cash to put in the cookie jar in the first place. If you're stony broke as a council, you can't create additional cash backed reserves because you haven't got the cash in the first place to save for tomorrow, you spend for today. You can very much save up for virtually anything you think you might need. And as I say, probably the most useful thing at the moment is it helpfully signals intent and future obligations. You've seen schools reserves balloon and you expect them to be spent. And my advice to you is don't try and reserve for everything. If you did, you wouldn't be able to afford it. Audit will test if they're reasonable to make sure I'm not hiding pots of money unnecessarily. You can swap them around at any point in time, but it looks a bit dodgy if you're doing it all the time. You're meant to set reserves up for the reason they're intended. But of course, if there's an urgent crisis, you might have to dip in and borrow them. The same spending rules apply to reserves because ultimately they support the underlying spend. If it was a capital reserve, it can only be spent on capital. If it's a revenue reserve, it can only be spent on revenue. And the big mantra, which you all know, is you can only spend them once. They're one-off pots of money. My advice is keep it simple. And this is where I do my usual cookie jar advice. Keep it simple, use them as savings pots, plan to use them over the medium to long term. You've seen a number of authorities get into difficulty over the years. Frankly speaking, I think some of my colleagues have tried to be far too clever. They've used reserves repeatedly to balance the books, or they've tried to be innovative, and it normally goes boom when the magic money tree runs out. So they're a bit of dark arts. They're a bit science as much as art, but they're also very, very simple at heart. and I couldn't resist it because always come back to me cookies. They're finite. I keep an eye on them. I have to report them in the public record, and the padlock is to remind you that many of them are those technical reserves tucked away in molten lava in outer space, as referred to in council. I'm going to stop presenting and hand back to you, Chris. I'm conscious you said it broke up a little bit doing that, so apologies for anyone who didn't hear it, but I decided some said they could hear and some couldn't, so I rattled through. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Are there any questions on that? Jeff Jones, Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. It's been really useful. But just to clarify in my mind, you know, you actually mentioned the funny money reserves that are, shall we say, worthless unless you actually dispose of something, you know. Now, if you actually disposed of something, shall we say, a building, a capital item, what can that money be actually used for? Is it constrained within the capital budget, or could that go into a reserve at the end of the day? Another question as well.
Effectively, it's a bit of both. So, as you rightly say, Councillor Jones, it's funny money. It gets unwound. It will result in a capital receipt on disposal. Mm-hmm. So you will get a debit to cash, and you will get a credit to capital receipts unapplied. And capital receipts unapplied are another form of an earmarked reserve. And when they are so applied, they come out of there and they're fully applied. But the same rules apply. The capital receipts can only be used for a revenue, for a capital purpose. So, but the capital receipt ends up funding part of the overall capital programme. You'll be aware, given the size of the capital programme, planned capital receipts are a relatively modest part of the overall programme. And then, as I refer to, some authorities that have got themselves into difficulty can apply to the Secretary of State for capitalisation directions to turn revenue into capital, and then apply the capital monies to help them out. But that is a clear indicator normally of an authority in extreme distress and duress, and so only done in absolute extremis. But that's effectively how it works. You end up swapping a funny money reserve for a real cash-backed reserve called an unapplied capital receipts reserve, and then when they're applied to use the capital programme, it's drawn down and the cash is actually spent on the physical asset that is then bought with them, and that's how the capital programme so effectively churns on the balance sheet. Does that help, Councillor Jones?
Yes, it does, yeah. And perhaps linked to that as well, just clarification, the capital equalisation reserve, the monies actually going into that are actually monies that are not spent on capital projects at the present time. And the capital equalisation reserve seems to be quite large. How is it funded so well at the present time?
So yeah, this one's an unusual one, and this is the one that sits in the middle zone and is our favourite. It's called Capital Equalisation Reserve, and the funding in it at the moment arises from savings on capital financing of the debt, which is itself a revenue item. So it's a revenue reserve, ostensibly badged to help smooth the cost of the capital financing, because most of our capital programme is propped up by substantial planned borrowing. Yeah. And that borrowing ultimately requires a minimum revenue provision and an interest payment, which falls to the revenue account. You will be aware, for the last couple of years, we've had very significant savings on the capital financing element because of the reasons I've taken through council, which has enabled money to go in there. But I've always been at pains to emphasise that I was expecting peak debt to arrive by 25-26, and I deferred an awful lot of that up to £200 million envelope. And that's what's enabled money to flow into the proverbial bath before I need to draw sums out. You will be at council getting my update report on Treasury management in November, and I will be advising you how very active I have been in the Treasury markets and done a very substantial amount of further debt externalisation. So it would be appropriate for me to update council more fully in due course. So you're right, it has grown significantly over the years. It has money added to and drawn away from it. But there will be a major update in November when I bring to council the latest on the Treasury management strategy and my borrowing activity. Because as you'll be aware, I have fully delegated authority to borrow and lend as I see fit in year. to take advantage of appropriate interest rates. So there'll be a major update in November on that for all of you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? No. Ben, can I go to the actual report itself, the revenue review of revenue reserves, and go to table, where is it? Table 3.11, category of earmarked reserves. I've gone through that, and the amount of cash we have in our reserves, which is spendable reserves, taking out the fact that the capital reserve is in there as well, is over £50 million, is it not? Because we got we got equalisation reserve 17 million, the capital reserve 7, contingency 10, recovery 20, well over 50 million. And that doesn't include the restructuring of 3 million. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. You've read that correctly. As I indicated, we added £17 million 2 years ago and £55 million last year. So there is very much significantly in excess of £50 million of cash-backed reserves available to spend. As I indicated in the first quarter monitoring report to Cabinet, the whole of the contingency sum of 10 million was fully committed to balance the budget at Q1. And you'll be aware from conversations to date, and again, there'll be councillor questions on council in November around the speed of spending the recovery fund, that you will see a very significant inroad to that. And also the schools one was particularly artificially inflated. You will be aware that our schools proportionately held higher reserves than any other authority, so absolutely held more than any other authority, and was certainly one of the highest proportionately in Wales, and they ballooned by another £14 million, but that was predominantly by last minute money coming from Welsh Government, and there is a commitment from them to spend significantly elements of that. So you will see very substantial inroads to those three reserves automatically. And if 2/3 of the school's money is spent, as they've indicated, over the next 2 years, that the contingency balance sheet fund of 10 million is spent and the whole of the recovery fund of 20 million is spent, you will see coming on 50 million quid spent very, very quickly, Councillor Holly.
Yeah, I can quite understand that, because of the school delegation reserve. A lot of that will have to be kept because we don't know what the uplift in the amount of money from the Welsh Government will be, and I think that will actually have a major effect on our £134.5 million, because we will not know exactly how much we got. I know we can't touch profit share on joint ventures, service earmark reserves. Those are issues which we can't touch. I understand that because they are there, but there is, as I said, over £50 million in cash reserves available to spend, which probably is the highest figure. And I'm not sure if Des may know more than I do, but I think that's one of the highest figures I've ever known in any local government in this part of Wales.
If I may come back, Chair, you're right. It's one of the highest we've ever had, and it will be late. You can't hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah,
I can hear you though.
Okay, I can
hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, coming back. We're certainly it's the highest we've ever had. It's certainly the highest we've ever had, and there will be the usual Welsh Government Stats Wales figures later in the year, and we will be at the higher end of reserves available as a whole. We won't be highest. There are one or two. There's one that will have absolutely higher reserves than us, and one that will have proportionately higher reserves. But certainly that they're at the high end. And I'd echo what you've said, Councillor Holly. I mean, as well as schools needing to hold on reserves because they're uncertain as to what they're going to get from the spending review and future Welsh Government settlements, the same applies to the authority as a whole. And I'd rather have some of that buffer, which has held us in very good stead for the last 2 years, because we've got an very uncertain outlook coming forward, and you'll hear more from me on the midterm budget statement at council on the 4th of November once again. So I am not bashful at holding quite a substantial amount of reserves to protect the authority's position in terms of the advice I give you. But equally, you will see that quite a lot of them are already being committed to spend. They're not just sat on the shelf gathering dust. But you're right, they are very, very substantial, and I'd rather have substantial reserves than not, because if the settlement is not particularly generous, we may be in for a rockier time, certainly over the medium term. Thank you.
I quite understand that, but at the same time, you know, we have taken money out of our the capitalisation reserve for a start off. We've got to make absolutely clear that that money has come from our revenue account and has been put in there, you know, whilst at the same time we have had some reductions in staff and services. So equalisation reserve has come from the revenue account, as all the others are that are cashback reserves. Okay, if there's anyone else? No? Well, if that's the case, can I thank you, Ben, very much for your review of reserves, and I look forward to you coming back in the near future.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Now then, we go on to the letters. And the first one is to Councillor Andrew Stevens, Cabinet Member. Okay. Are there any issues about that letter? No. Okay, then we go on to the work. Go on to the work programme. I can get it up on the screen. Here it comes. Okay, work programme. We are now. Where are we? We are now on meeting 5, which we've just done. We now have meeting 6, which is on the 16th of November, and you can see that we will have Ben again. And I'm not sure about the planning annual performance report. We will be on the Swansea airport. Those we will be having a pre-meeting on the 11th of November. I would urge members, if they can, to come along to the 11th of November. I think it's going to be incredibly important that we have that, which will be held in camera, because I think it's important that we realise that the issues that could well come up in both those items could be of importance to the council, and that's why we're going to have this pre-meeting, and it's going to be in camera. And then on Wednesday, the 15th of December, we have recycling and the final draft budget. Then you see the performance monitoring, commission reviews outcome on the 18th of January. Tuesday, the 15th of February, we have budget scrutiny, and meeting 10, progress on the local government use of data action plan and Welsh Public Library standard. Anybody got any comments on the work plan? Somebody's got their hand up. Is it?
It's me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's about the November the 11th one. I know I spoke to you, Chris, and there's absolutely no way that I'll be able to make it. And I did ask if you could try and change the time, because Jeff probably wouldn't be able to make it, and yourself if it's still at 10 o'clock, because the Senate off is at 11, and I know quite a number of us like to go. I'm there obviously as Lord Mayor, but I know other councillors like to attend.
I'll have a word with Emily at the end of this meeting now to see if we could move it forward, and if we can, we will.
Yeah, okay. Even if we had it at 9 on that day, it's okay, but 10 o'clock is, you know, not giving people time.
What about making it later in the day?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I don't have a problem. It's just, as you know,
yes, I'll have a word.
The chair, yeah.
I will have a word with Emily now to see if we can rearrange it from that time, because obviously the 11th of November is very important for us as a public, in our public roles.
Yeah.
Okay, Irene, you had your hand up.
Yes, I need to say, just supporting Councillor Jones with reference to moving the time of the meeting on the 11th. I always attend the Cenotaph and I know it means an awful lot to all of us. So if there is any possibility of that, I would be most appreciative. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do that now then when at the end of the meeting I'll talk to Emily. Okay, if that is all, can I thank you all for attending, and I'll speak to you soon.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thanks, Chair.